welcome to week 2 of our Detox series. My name is Laura. I'm one of the leaders around here at Center Church, and I get the pleasure of sharing with you this morning. And when I sat down to start on things and I looked at this word detox, I thought, man, that word really can carry some interesting connotations for you depending on who you are today. And some of you might be like, yeah, let's detox, sounds great. And others of you might remind me more of a gentleman I met at Costco one time. I was filling up the, whatever you put your groceries on, whatever that's called. I was putting my food out on there and had a couple kids in the cart, and this older gentleman, probably old enough to be my grandpa, was chatting with the kids and having a good time. And then I reached in the cart and I lifted up some green juice. I like me some green juice. And so I lifted it up and I set it on the conveyor belt thing, and the little old man leans into my kids and says, "Kids, if your mom mentions a word detox, run." And maybe you feel like him. Maybe you hear the word detox or cleanse and you're like, I'm out. I don't want anything to do with it. But we are diving into this topic of detox. And sometimes it's not fun. Sometimes we don't enjoy the process of detoxing, but it's incredibly important for our lives. And I was reminded of another gentleman I met, our family met a while back, a couple months back here, calls himself Farmer Joe. I don't even know his last name, Farmer Joe. And he was teaching the kids about farming, and then he looked up at me and said, "And Mom, you know, if they won't eat their vegetables, you can just have them take a bath in it." And I looked at him like he was crazy. I was like, that what? No, like, I'll just make them eat their vegetables. And he said, "No, it's what I suggest to parents." He said, "Think about it. If you took a bath in poison, wouldn't that poison get into your body?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I would never take a bath in poison." And he said, "It's the same with the good stuff. It's the same with the good stuff. We can take a bath in the good stuff. We can surround ourselves with the good stuff, and that gets into." And I loved that idea of getting the bad out and getting the good in, and it was just a great picture to me of what detox really symbolizes. It's more than just getting rid of, but it's filling up with some new stuff too. And so whether it's physical stuff we eat, or emotional or spiritual toxins, we are all fielding these things that are coming into us that are wreaking havoc in our lives. And that's what we're looking at in this series. Last week we saw, and it's gonna pop up on your screen, that a detox is a removal of toxic substances from a living organism. The Bible talks about this process in 2 Corinthians 6, and we looked at the whole verse, a bigger section of this last week. I'm just gonna pull us to this last verse here. Verse 17 says, "Let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God." Last week we looked at the importance of detoxing our spirits. Josh explained that our spirit is the part of us that is like God, or the spiritual part of us, and that part of us can get filled up with these toxins of negativity and doubt and sin, and we have to detox from those things. We have to get them out of our lives, and we do that with God's word and with worship and with prayer. And as we continue to look at that, today we're talking about the soul, and I first kind of was like, yeah, soul. What exactly do we mean when we say soul? And I actually had to do some work on, like, we hear this word a lot, but I don't know that we necessarily always take it for what it actually means. And so I did some looking in, and first I looked in Webster's dictionary, and that defines soul as a person's moral or emotional nature. And then when we look at the Bible, in Hebrew, soul translates to the Hebrew word for living being or life. And then in the Greek, which is the New Testament portion, when we see soul there, it kind of is translated to breath of life. So when we look at all of those things, what we see is that our soul is the emotional part of us. It's the life part of us. It's our feeling and our thinking. And I saw this, and I want you to write this down. You are not a body with a soul. You are a soul with a body. You're not a body with a soul, you are a soul with a body. Sometimes we think, oh, my body is who I am, but that's not true. Our soul is who we are. This is actually the part of us that's gonna live into eternity. This is the part of us that will continue on when our physical bodies fade away. And so you are not a body with a soul, you are a soul with a body. And so sometimes what happens to our soul is life happens, and as we go through our days, these toxins start to creep in. And we see in the book of Psalm, David is talking about how his soul is feeling as these different toxins have crept in over the span of his life. And he says, "Why am I discouraged? Why is my heart so sad?" Another version says, "Why so downcast my soul?" When the emotional part of us starts to get weighed down with these toxins, these things polluting our soul, our emotions, we'll even start to see it spill out into other areas of our lives. We snap at the grocery clerk, even though it's toxin from back here that's really spilling out, or we lose it on our kids. I lose it on my kids, and really it has nothing to do with what they're doing, but something else that's going on inside of me. And so today we're gonna look at, I could give you a list of 20 or 30 soul toxins, but we just don't have time for that. So I chose a few. We're gonna look at a few things that I think all of us can relate to as things we deal with on a regular basis, that can become toxic for our souls. And then we're gonna look at some ways to move forward and to detox from these toxins we experience. So this first one, it's gonna be number one on your outline. Our first soul toxin is unforgiveness. Unforgiveness. And I know some of you hear that word and you're immediately like, no, thank you. I'm gonna take a pass on this next section. I don't wanna talk about forgiveness or why I need to. This person hurt me, this thing happened, and I don't wanna talk about it. And so before we move on and talk any further on this concept of forgiveness, I just wanna make sure you know that what we're gonna talk about, what I'm gonna share, does nothing to diminish pain. It doesn't erase the horrible things that may have happened, the hurt that you carry. Forgiveness isn't about that. It's not about the size of the offense or what this person did or that, but the truth is that when we carry it around, no matter how big or small the pain is from that hurt or that offense that was done to us, when we carry that around, it has the power to pollute our souls. And so we want to take a look at this and say, what can we do to detox some of that pain? And one of those things is forgiveness. Hebrews 12:15 says, "See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many." Well, how many of us are walking around with a bitter root inside, just waiting to grow up and cause us trouble? That's exactly what unforgiveness is. It's a bitterness that causes us trouble. I've heard it said before that forgiveness isn't for you; it's for the other. I'm sorry, it's not for the other person, but it's for you. And we can roll our eyes at that and feel like, ooh, but it's true. It's not for the other person or letting them off the hook or any of those things. It's for us. It's seeing that nothing grows up to cause us trouble inside our soul. Another way of putting it is forgiveness is like setting yourself on fire and hoping the other person dies of smoke inhalation. It just doesn't make any sense. We would never do that. I can hold on to my hurt, but the only person I'm hurting is me. One of the greatest stories I've ever heard of this concept of forgiveness comes from the Rwandan genocide. It actually happened in 1994. I'm not going to tell you how old I was, but I don't remember it. I was that young. And so I had to do some research, and I couldn't find the exact story I was looking for, but I came across this story in the New York Times, and it was released 20 years after the genocide. So I don't know, you do the math, not too long ago. And what they did is they went and they interviewed. See, what's happening in that country now is they're moving towards reconciliation. And so while the genocide was terrible, so many people were killed or hurt, and it was awful, it was terrible. And what's happening now is this chance for forgiveness. So the offenders are going to the people they've offended, the people they've hurt, and asking for forgiveness. And one person, there was this little story, and it was this is a quote from somebody who was forgiving an offense. This is, they were speaking of the person that had watched their brother be killed and not done anything about it. He stood in the line that killed this other man's brother, and he had gone and asked for forgiveness. And the man doing the forgiving, the man offering forgiveness said this: "Sometimes justice does not give someone a satisfactory answer. Cases are subject to corruption," speaking of the legal system. "But when it comes to forgiveness, willingly granted, one is satisfied once and for all. When someone is full of anger, he can lose his mind. But when I granted forgiveness, my mind felt at rest." When we're full of anger, we can lose our mind. But when we grant forgiveness, we can rest. It's not saying what happened wasn't wrong, but it's releasing the power of that bitterness in your life and that toxin in your soul so that you can move on to a healthier way. Another soul toxin we all probably deal with is number 2, comparison or jealousy. Now, I know these two things aren't exactly the same, but I do think they go hand in hand. And when we begin to compare, jealousy and envy inevitably root up inside of us. And so, when I look at jealousy, I actually, just a few weeks back, got to watch this in my kids firsthand, and it made me think we don't really need to be taught how to do these things. They come hardwired, hard installed in us. We know how to be jealous. It's just there. I was reading the story of Moses to my kids, and we were at the part where he's received the 10 commandments. So we were reading through the different commandments, and you've probably heard them, whether or not you've been in church a long time. You've heard of at least a few of the 10 commandments. Maybe you watched that Easter show of the story of Moses every year on Easter. I watched it as a kid. I don't even remember who the actors were, but you're probably a little bit familiar. Commandment number 10 is do not be envious or jealous of your neighbor and what they have. And as soon as I read that to my kids, my older 2 kids, 11 and 9 years old, went, "What? You want me to do what? Not be jealous? How do I do that?" It was like this innate reaction in them of but I want what they have. How do I not be jealous? It's just in us. And if we don't regularly work to detox from this comparison and this jealousy, it will root up in us and it will wreak havoc on our lives. I think we all have this tendency toward jealousy when we begin to compare. I want that job. I want that car. I want that spouse. I want those kids. I want that life. It doesn't take long when we're looking outward to start to feel like what we have isn't enough, or to start to compare our lives to other people. Social media is making this an even bigger problem than it's ever been before. We are all struggling with that. It's something our younger generations will have to grow up in and learn to navigate at a much younger age than most of us ever had to. And the biggest problem with this comparison game and this jealousy game is that it's taking our eyes off of what really matters. It's taking our eyes off of who really matters. It's distracting us from what God says about our life, and it's our own selfishness and our own maybe discontentment that is coming up and saying, "Oh, I want that," and we're not looking at what God wants for our lives. James 3:14 and 16 says, "But if you have bitter jealousy," there's that word bitter again, "and selfish ambition that I want for me, selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Ooh. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice." Jealousy and comparison breed disorder. And did you catch that at the end? Every vile practice. Not just some, not just a few, or not even most. Every vile practice comes from this jealousy and this comparison, this selfish ambition. And so when we are living lives of comparison and giving into the jealousy, our souls can become toxic. Something I'm actually in the middle of right now is a social media fast. I do these about twice a year. I take about a week off of social media and just quit the scrolling, quit the liking or the commenting or the comparing, and take a break. And what I found coming into this one was just that my soul needed a break. I needed to remove some of the toxicity that was entering my soul, that was getting in places that was kind of rooting up jealousy and discontentment, and so I took a break. And let me be clear, the content I follow on Instagram isn't really toxic content. I follow authors and pastors and speakers and friends. I follow NASA because my son loves space, and I follow Puppies of Instagram because my daughters love puppies, and I have a friend who loves puppies, and I like to send her puppy pictures because I know they make her day. So I'm not really following content that is on its own negative. I'm not really following things that are down and are dark and are those sorts of things. But what comes out of me if I'm not careful, if I don't watch myself, is the jealousy. I start to see the perfect picture of the perfect kids and get a little more annoyed at my not so perfect kids, or the date night, or the new car, or the vacation. And I started, well, I want that. Well, I want that. And it's not about that being wrong. It's about what's in me, and it's bringing it out. And so I'm taking a break. I'm saying I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to detox from that part of soul toxins that is getting into my life. The last soul toxin I want to talk about today, and I think it's pretty poignant in our specific intersection of life and culture and all that's going on in the world. But the third one is this, number 3, write it down: weariness. Weariness. Have you ever just felt like, I'm so tired? I don't want to do this anymore. I am just worn down. I have taken one too many punches and I just want to lay down and take a nap. Maybe you feel that way right now. Our souls can become weary, and that weariness and that tiredness can become toxic for them. I think of it this way. So in high school, I swam and I played water polo. And on swim team, which I really only did because I loved water polo so much and it made you better at water polo. But what we would do is we would, a part of our training was to wear drag, which is just adding weight to what we were wearing while we swam so that our bodies would have to work harder. So in the beginning of the season, it looked like Hell Week, which was 2 weeks of intensive, like 2-a-day practices, a lot of work. We would actually swim in sweatshirts, sweatpants, and tennis shoes. I'm not kidding. We would get out there at 5 a.m. in all our clothes and jump in the pool and swim. And we would do that for a couple weeks, and then we would enter more the regular season, and we would continue to do this. You'd wear an old, raggedy, worn out bathing suit, or they actually sold special bathing suits that were designed for drag. Girls would not shave their legs. I know I'm getting a little weird here, but it's true. We were committed. This is how we trained. And then at the end of the season, when all the finals were coming up, we would let it go. We would stop wearing, we would leave it at home, and we wouldn't swim with the drag anymore. The girls would shave their legs. Some of the guys would shave their legs. People were shaving their arms. I mean, it was like we got rid of every extra bit we were carrying. And that's kind of like the weariness. So the drag was creating weariness on our muscles. And as we trained, we got used to pulling more weight through the water. And then when we let it all go, it was like floating. It was like it was almost effortless because we had let it all go. And I think that's true for us. I think sometimes in our lives we start to carry and pack on so much stuff, and we turn around twice and we're carrying way more than we need to be. And we gotta let it go. So what can cause our soul to be weary? I wanna look at a couple things real quick. The first thing that can cause weariness in our soul is pain from our past. Past hurts that we're still holding on to can create weariness. It's kind of circling back to this concept of forgiveness. When we carry it for too long, we become weary, and that weariness is toxic for our soul. Another thing that can create weariness in our souls is present trouble. Present trouble. I think we'd all agree that we're experiencing some present trouble. Pandemic, job loss, isolation, extreme racial tension. We are navigating some very heavy and troubled times. On top of the regular day-to-day, the diagnosis, the broken down car, the tantruming kids, the kids with that are struggling. We are navigating very, very difficult, unprecedented, as people keep saying, times, and it's creating a lot of present trouble, and we're weary. I don't know about you guys, but these last couple months, I am weary. I'm tired. And actually, Jesus even promises us that this present trouble concept is going to come. In John 16:33, he tells us, in this world you will have troubles. Not a might, not a could, but you will. We will have troubles this side of heaven. It's a guarantee. And those can make us weary. But there's more in that verse, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But the last thing before we move forward that can cause weariness in our souls is fear for the future. Fear for the future. Are you afraid of how the economy is going to do in the next few years? Fear. It's an election year. Are you a little bit afraid? What about the health diagnosis you just got, or the child that's struggling, or maybe your marriage? We don't always know what's coming in our future. In fact, we almost never know what's coming in our future. And I think most of us would prefer it the opposite. We'd like to know what's coming, but we don't. And sometimes that fear can cripple us. It can stop us in our tracks. And so what do? When we're downcast, when we're troubled, when we're heavy, when comparison and jealousy and unforgiveness and weariness and all of the other things that can be toxic for our souls, when they're bearing down all of their weight on us, what do? We're gonna let it go. All right, and we're gonna walk through some steps in a minute on how we can begin that process of letting these toxins go. We hold on to them like that, like the drag I wear when I was swimming, or like the Rwandan survivor held on to the pain, extreme pain of what had happened in their life. And then we choose to let it go. And when we do that, we experience a lightness and an ease in life that maybe we didn't even know was possible. So let's take a look for the next few minutes here on what we can do to begin to detox from these soul toxins. The first one is establish right relationships. Right relationships. What do we mean by this when we talk about that? Well, what that means is beginning to invest in some relationships that are life-giving. I would imagine that most of us spend at least a good portion of our day in some sort of toxic environment. Maybe it's work, maybe it's family that we're dealing with, maybe it's our kids, maybe it's our marriage right now. There's some toxicity happening somewhere in your life, and the relationships you're maybe even investing in right now are not helping you to detox from all of this stuff. They're actually adding to it. And so what we want, what this means is to establish those friendships, people who lift you up, who can carry your burdens. I'm in a small group. We've been meeting virtually through the pandemic, and I actually got a really good picture just a few weeks ago of what right relationship looks like. See, we don't all look the same. We don't all have even extremely similar lives. We've got single moms. We've got married moms. We've got moms of older, moms of younger. We are all moms, but some people in our group have struggled to become moms, and so our lives all look extremely different. But yet we gather every Monday night and we connect, and we have found some right relationship. And here's the picture of that. We were studying a book, and one of the chapters addressed this phrase that maybe you've heard or said before: "Must be nice." And it was talking about how we compare, we look at something else going on in someone else's life and say, well, that must be nice. And I was sitting there, and one of the questions was, when have you done this? And it didn't take me long to realize I had done it in that group. I had sat in the same room as these other women and thought, must be nice. And I was actually a little bit nervous to share it because I didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But I said, guys, I want to share something. And I looked at one person. I said, I felt that about you. I've uttered that in my head after you said something one time. And it could have gone a couple ways. It could have gone like, oh, how dare you? Da, 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 da. We could have gotten all mad and fought and all of that. But all we got was, me too. We actually, at the end of it, all agreed that we've all had those moments with each other. And so this right relationship doesn't have to look all like we're the same person or we're all even believing all of the same things, but it means that there's grace and there's compassion, and we are all working towards a better relationship with God. And we are spurring each other on in that and encouraging each other to follow His path for our lives. And when we don't know what to do, we look to His Word. And the ability to be real about who you are without worry or concern or what people are going to say or do, or if they're going to walk out or how they're going to treat you afterwards, that's a right relationship. And if you're actually looking for one of those or looking to get connected, we do have a Wednesday night small group that meets here. You can jump on that. That's exactly where you can get started in your journey of finding right relationships. So that's number one. Let's look at what the Bible has to say about right relationships. Proverbs 13:20 says, "He who walks with the wise grows wise, but a companion of fool suffers harm." Do you have any fools in your life? Maybe it's time to cut some of them out. Maybe they are suffering harm and bringing you along for the ride. It's time to invest in some right relationships. The next thing we can do to begin to detox our souls is discover our God-defined identity. A God-defined identity. Well, what does that mean? We need to be looking to the one who made us to tell us who we are. oftentimes our culture and our world is shouting at us who they want us to be. And in order to detox our souls from that pressure and that trying to be someone we're not, we've got to look to the one who made us. And if you don't think God knows much about your life, just go read Psalm 139. It's a whole chapter dedicated to how well God knows you and how he made you, and he's the one that knows you better than anyone on the planet. When we look to things like our feelings or social media likes or shares or maybe a friend that sent us a blog that's telling us about what we're supposed to do next, when we start to let our souls be cluttered with all of these different ideas of who we're supposed to be, we can lose sight of who God says we're supposed to be. Galatians speaks to this. It says in 6:4, make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you have been given, and then sink yourself into that. Don't be impressed with yourself and don't compare yourself to others. I love that imagery. Sink yourself into, anchor yourself into the work God is calling you to. Explore what you are, who you are to be, and the work you have been given. You might call it staying in your lane. And I'm slowly learning this. The world doesn't need more people trying to be better at the same thing. The world needs more people passionately pursuing the call God has on their life and running towards that and not worried about what's going on outside of that. That last part, don't compare yourself with others. I mean, hello, we're talking about comparison. We don't need to look about where everyone else is going on their path. We can stay on our path and pursue what our God-defined identity is. The third way we can rid our souls of toxins is this next bullet: live a crucified life. Live a crucified life. Well, we actually just wrapped up a series a few weeks ago on the book of Galatians, and Josh spent a whole Sunday talk on this concept of a crucified life. And so just a brief recap, a reminder of what that looks like is really, it's a laying down of our desires and our selfish ambition, like we looked at earlier, and it's a picking up of what Christ is doing in our lives and pursuing that rather than what we would want, what our flesh would want, what our desires are. When I let that go, when I die to my selfish ambition and my jealousy and my holding grudges and holding on to things, what I really do is open a door to God. I open a door to his purposes and his promises and his will for my life. And that's what living a crucified life is. It's laying down what I might want and picking up what Christ might want. And Paul is actually a fantastic example of this in the New Testament. He's one of, I think, the greatest examples of a crucified life. See, if you're not familiar, before Paul was Paul, he was Saul. And Saul had a very toxic soul. His soul was filled with toxins, and he was bitter, and he was angry, and he was taking it out on people. He was taking it out on Christians. He was actually known for killing and persecuting Christians. And then somewhere along his journey and in his life, the Lord encounters him and really kind of shakes him at his core. And from that moment on, Saul, who he had been, is changed, and he becomes Paul, and he really dedicates the rest of his life, most of which would be spent in prison, being persecuted for his belief in Jesus, but he spends the rest of his life living a crucified life, dying to his own desires, and picking up what Christ has for him. And he says this in Galatians, it's Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. If you want to detox your soul, you got to move in the direction of a crucified life. The last thing, it's one of my favorite ones on the list, but the last one is living with eternal perspective. I find this idea so incredibly helpful in seasons where my soul is tired, where there's a heaviness in my soul. I think when we struggle with these soul toxins, the unforgiveness, the jealousy, the weariness, it's usually because we've taken our eyes off of what's to come, and we're focused on right now, this side of heaven, this side of eternity. And the truth is, there's so much more after the troubles we face here on this earth, and the present reality that we're living in clouds our view of what's to come. And the Bible tells us this about eternal perspective. It says in Colossians 3:1-2, since then you have been raised with Christ. Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. And I want to point out something in this verse. You see there it says that Christ is seated at the right hand of God. And that might just kind of sound like a cool phrase to us today, but when this was written and the people who would have read this letter would have understood almost immediately, the right hand signified something very important. When a commander of an army would go into battle and when they won a victory over their enemies, they would come back with whoever survived and they would have a celebration, a feast and a festival. And that commander would sit at the right hand of the king or the leader of that nation. And that just sitting there showed everyone that they had won, that they were the victor. So that seat, that right hand of God, is so much more than just sitting next to him as a lunch buddy. It's showing us that God has already won the victory. Jesus has already conquered all of the things that might be wearing us down, and that we can set our minds on that. That is the picture. That is the eternal perspective that we can have because Jesus has won. Romans 16:20 says, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you." I love that because sometimes I need a reminder that what I'm battling isn't necessarily right here, but there's an enemy of my soul. He wants all these toxins to stay there. He wants to see me weary and holding on to unforgiveness. He wants to see me comparing. He doesn't want my eyes focused on God. He wants me tired and he wants me separated from God. And this verse reminds us that not just gonna win, but he's gonna crush Satan under your feet. All of this toxicity in our souls, all of these heavy loads we're carrying can drag us down, but they don't have to. We can lay these down at the hands and feet of Jesus. We can lay down the unforgiveness. We can ask him to help us forgive. We can fix our eyes on him to rid ourselves of comparison and jealousy. We can lay down the things that are burdening us and causing us weariness. And as we seek those other 4 things we looked at, right relationships and God identity and a crucified life in this eternal perspective, we can rise up with hope that we don't have to carry it anymore. We have somebody who's already won, and he wants to carry it with us. Would you pray? Father God, we love you. We thank you that you are in our corner and you are with us. God, this week as we look at the things that are creating toxicity in our souls, the emotional part of us, our feelings, God, would you help us? Would you make clear our next steps as we move through the detox of our souls? Would you send us encouragement as we walk out what you have for us, God? Keep our eyes fixed on you and your plan for us. In your name we pray. Amen.